Wachuma or San Pedro is a cousin of peyote. So for your viewers who are not very familiarized with many of these plants, probably if they have not heard of San Pedro, they probably heard of peyote. It's a little bit more, if you wanted, famous, and at least
Mm.
for the name. And these are cacti that their active compound or their active alkaloid is mescaline. They have many other alkaloids in them. Mescaline is contained in peyote or in San Pedro, but there's many other alkaloids present in them. Mescaline docks into serotonin receptors as well as dopamine receptors, which is connected to norepinephrine, which is adrenaline. This is why a lot of people in that pathway get very active on it. Some people take it, they might be sleepy, they might be tired, and 2 hours later, they just want to run a marathon and go hiking, which is one of the ways in which is consumed right now in the Andes, where
Mm.
the cactus comes from, is by consuming it and then going on a pilgrimage where they go on these 12-hour hikes around the mountains. And every few hours, they talk to a river, they talk to a tree, they talk to the water, to the sun, to a mountain. And it's really beautiful. And then Iboga, the one that I was telling you about from Africa, is pretty incredible because it is the only plant known to man that docks into 5 family of receptors. So ayahuasca docks into serotonin, the serotonin family, I would say, because serotonin receptors, we have somewhere around 15 to 17. I can't remember exactly, but yeah, you have the 5-HT2A, 5-HT2B, to C, and then there's other ones, right? So that's a whole family of receptors where ayahuasca docks into. The same with dopamine. It also is a family of receptors. And there's other ones like opiate receptors. So opiate receptors is where morphine, heroin, Oxycontin, fentanyl, all of the opiates, whether they are legal or not. And we have sigma receptors as well. Basically, we have a bunch of different families of receptors. And ibogaine, which is the active compound in it, docks into 5 of them, which is pretty unique, which is why the experience is so multifaceted. And it can take you on a very long journey that it is looks and feels very different every couple hours. It's like,
Mm.
yeah, it just starts in one place, takes you to a very different one, and then takes you to a very different, because it's as the main alkaloid, which is ibogaine, starts metabolizing, starts docking into different receptors and giving you a very different experience. But for DMT, it's just ayahuasca. So psilocybin is a molecule that is very similar to DMT. The structure of psilocybin is almost the same as a DMT, with the difference of an oxygen and a hydrogen. And it also docks into serotonin receptors, which is maybe why I wouldn't completely assure this, but the psilocybin experience has ayahuasca-like moments where people are
Mm.
like, oh, I feel like I'm on Aya, not on mushrooms.
Hmm.
So it docks into the same receptors and the molecule is very similar.
So, out of curiosity, the different receptors that are being docked into, is that what dictates the uniqueness of the hallucinations? Because I have experienced mescaline of peyote, San Pedro, ayahuasca,
Mhm.
psilocybin, and the hallucinations are all a very unique experience, with psilocybin and ayahuasca feeling similar in terms of the way I would see the energy and the way the energy would show up in terms of visualizations. However, ayahuasca is the only one where you actually feel like you're connecting to an entity and having in depth, beautiful conversations with this entity who is collaborating with you in creating the experience
Mhm.
and is a messenger bringing information. No other plant that I've ever worked with have I had that interaction, which was just an incredible interaction to feel like you actually have a guide that's internal with you, as well as the guides that are supporting you externally outside of yourself.
I love your question. And it's actually one of my favorite topics because this is where we can start mixing science and spirituality in a way that unites them, and in a way that makes me feel that science and spirit are just worldviews. Basically, there is an experience here, and then you can see it through the lens of science, or you can see it through the lens of spirit, and they are both true. Since we have an experience that splits into these two ways of seeing it, I always felt that these two sides, science and spirit, must be correlated, partially because your question is not exactly well understood through science. The good thing about the spiritual aspect is that you don't have to necessarily prove it. Feeling is enough, which I'm sure a lot of scientists out there hearing this are cringing. I would cringe too if I would hear myself a few years ago say these things. But first, we have to acknowledge that we do not understand the answer to that question through the lens of science. It is true that psychedelics that dock into serotonin receptors have a tendency to create some level of visionary distortion. So ayahuasca and psilocybin, LSD as well, and then mescaline also at the right doses, they start creating visual distortions, which some people call it hallucinations, some people call it visions. I think also there's a distinction there where hallucination implies that you're seeing something that is not there. A vision implies that you are finally seeing, right? Like you are seeing what was there, but that you couldn't see. So, but with that being said, yes, depending on which receptor it docks into, the style of vision or hallucination is going to vary drastically. It is mainly the serotonin receptors that are in charge of creating those mostly intense kind of visual distortions. You have substances like ketamine, for example, do not dock into serotonin receptors, even though they are somewhat psychedelic and they create a journey. They are almost they're almost non-existent. You know, people call it like they dive into a K-hole or they get to experience certain emotions, but there's not like a vision or a hallucination. With Iboga starts with docking into serotonin receptors at first, which is the only part in which you actually, that first part of the Iboga experience is called the visionary stage of Iboga. Once it leaves your serotonin receptors and starts docking into the opiate and sigma receptors, your visions go away, even though you're still extremely emotional and very much in your journey. That is the science aspect of it. To answer the questions through the spirit aspect of it, I would say there's also this perspective in which you have a experience, and that experience is ayahuasca, her essence. Let's start with ayahuasca, then we can copy that explanation for all of the other ones. But you have ayahuasca, which is not a chemical and is not a vision or an entity. Ayahuasca is a form of existence or consciousness or reality. When you consume it through the lens of spirit, you get to interact with that raw energy, raw consciousness. However, that needs to have also, since it started here and it's split it in two through our lens, this is the lens of spirit. This is what we just talked about. But what's going on here? And these two things need to correlate. So what I started feeling throughout these years is that a spiritual representation of ayahuasca must have a physical representation in its chemistry. Our way of saying that is that the spirit is the chemistry and the chemistry is the spirit. When I look at a plant through the lens of science and I see a combination of alkaloids, I know that that is the way in which a spirit represents itself in the physical form. On the other side of seeing that is when I see all of these chemicals, I know that if I consume them, I'm going to experience a spirit. But at the end, they are just both representations from different lenses of an experience that it is that raw energy. And I think that's the best. I hope I made myself clear.
So my interpretation of hearing that was that the spirit of the plant has its own chemical makeup or chemical imprint. By
Yeah.
accessing that chemical makeup or that chemical signature fingerprint, I'm accessing the spirit associated with that chemical imprint. That's
Yes,
beautiful. I
absolutely.
love that.
And our receptors are the antennas. So it's like once this chemical docks into your receptor, you get to experience the spirit of what that chemical was representing physically, right? So it's like I got to see this beautiful vision once in one of my journeys where your receptors are just little antennas that once it docks, it's like they turn on, they go online. It's like turning on the TV and you get to see what they are connecting to. And the chemical itself is the instructions to the receptor, right? The chemicals in ayahuasca, when they dock into your receptor, are giving an instruction to your receptor saying, turn on the TV in channel 8. That's where you'll meet ayahuasca. You take this chemical away and you put mescaline in it. And then that's another set of instructions that says, now turn the channel TV on channel 10. You will find mescaline there or the experience of mescaline. Some people do experience mescaline as a spirit in the same way in which you described ayahuasca. Some people experience mushrooms in the same way. Mescaline is experienced more as a father. Ayahuasca is experienced more as a mother, which answers the question that we talked about at the beginning of the podcast. People call it a mother because it embodies that energy, is how it feels within. And mushrooms are experienced as children. And a lot of societies, without really even having these conversations, call them, like in Argentina, we call it, would you want to consume some niños? Because they embody that energy. But if you didn't, it's simply where you're at, what you need to see in each journey. It's not that a lot of people don't experience ayahuasca as an entity or as a mother. Maybe they don't do it for 10 journeys. And then in the 11th, they finally get to see her or quote unquote meet her. It also depends what you're most connected with and what it is that you need. Yeah.
But what you said really resonates with me in terms of the energies associated with the plants. My interactions with psilocybin has always felt a little mischievous and playful and a little like very childlike. My interaction with peyote and San Pedro has always felt very grounded, like a masculine container of safety where I could explore and play, and also very heartfelt, sitting in the heart space very deeply. And then the experience with ayahuasca, she came to me. I had heard many times people refer to her as mother, a snake, a grandmother, and all these different entities. But for me, she felt like my higher self in a more mature, older, wiser fashion, as if the veil had thinned. My higher future self could come down and guide me, talk me through some of these past experiences that I could let go of that were no longer serving me, and how I could honor and love myself at a deeper level. It was just a really incredible experience with all three of these particular plants. Your description really resonated with me, and I'd never heard that before.
Awesome. I'm glad I can give that perspective.